Good evening and welcome to the second live stream to look at what we can do as parents and educators to include children more fully in the outdoor environment and help them to begin to explore permaculture. Now, during the last live stream, I mentioned that there are three levels of engagement that I tend to look at when it comes to children of various ages. There's immersion for preschool and early elementary ages, exploration for late elementary and middle school ages, and then a period of reflection then that comes as children get older, which is what I usually look at and think of for teenagers. And so, with that in mind, I reached out to members of the audience and checked with them to see who had children and what the children's ages were. And the responses that I got were that generally children tended towards the younger side. So tonight I want to look at the immersion stage of introducing children to the outdoor world. And so that will be our focus for tonight. One thing that I want to address, which I don't remember if I mentioned in the last video or not, is that one idea when it comes to environmental education is that when we're working with children, that there are no tragedies before the fourth grade. So that during that time, we want to make sure that we are working on pleasant and joyous experiences. And so, when we're even though we as adults might be concerned about climate change, species loss, habitat loss, and everything that goes with that, when it comes to our younger children, that's a part of the conversation that we want to save until they're older. And instead focus on helping them learn to love the world around them, to be a part of that world. And so with that, I think that one of the places that I like to think about this from a permaculture perspective is if you're familiar with the zone model, that the zone model in permaculture of, you start with yourself. If you look at 0, 0, then you have your home at 0, then 1 is like your front door to car door kind of idea. And these kind of zones of use. When it comes to young children in particular, I like to start close to home, beginning with kind of some home economics conversations about ways that we can, care for Earth and reduce waste. Because for me, when it comes to introducing children to permaculture at this stage, I really like to focus on the ethics and talking about how can we care for Earth. How can we care for people? And that allows us to, talk about how we can give back to people and the other than human. And through that space and the ethics, we can introduce permaculture to kids and talk with them about, what are these things that we can do to care in this way? And I think that using care as kind of one of our keywords, one of our models to work within as we're immersing children is combined with that zone model is looking for things that are close to home that we care about. A big one for my children, because we were on a migration route for monarch butterflies, we spread around milkweed seeds. We did what we could in order to take care of something that we saw regularly. And I think this is important because as much as we might love polar bears or koalas or any of those other kind of charismatic creatures in our environment, that there's something that we're not going to get to know or be able to care for directly. My daughter, as she's gotten older, has really come to love manatees. And so if you're not able to go and, visit that habitat, which fortunately, as she got older, we were able to take her and she could see that. But generally speaking, when she was younger, trying to focus on those animals that were in the backyard or that we could find in a park and take care of and do what we could to create habitat in our backyard and things like that. But I say starting close to home because for me, I like to look for easy and repeatable experiences that we can do with children throughout the year and year to year. And so that we can continue, there's this idea in, um, educational approaches of loop learning so that we continue to cycle back around to different ideas. And so, especially with young children, I like to do activities that are frequent and a regular part of their lives. So that would be, just spending time outdoors with young children, going on scavenger hunts to see what animals we can find around us. Again, whether that's in our yard or in a park. Um, and designing that around, it's like, what animals can we find? Start to teach the names of some basic plants. Here in the mid-Atlantic, narrow and broad-leaved plantain are ones that I really like to use because they're everywhere. Clover, when it comes in, because those white flowers are something that's easy to find. Violets, which violets are also one of my first forage plants that I introduce children to, because they're safe. If you're in the right environment, you know that the violets haven't been sprayed, and because you can, as children get older, if you include them more in the kitchen, be able to harvest those violets and make things like violet syrup, and continue to show the ways that, again, through these loops and through the zones, that we can bring plants into our home and make use of them for food or drink, or if we want to introduce medicinals at some point, medicine as well. And then, as a repeatable experience, once we do this with violets, we could bring in dandelions. Maybe we're pressing flowers or using them to color paper. But yeah, and just continue to build on that throughout the year, and then year after year return to those same activities but make them a bit more complex over time. As I say with the example with violets, not only learning how to eat them, but then also, how can we use them around the home, how can we cook with them. When we do go out into the world, in the first one of these conversations I mentioned boundaries. And when it comes to creating activities or presenting activities, I like to use bounded decisions or bounded choices and present a series of options for what we could do using some of the things that I mentioned today. Do you want to go pick violets? Do you want to go on a scavenger hunt and look for animals in the yard? Or do you want to, spend some time in the kitchen? And then by offering some choices that then the children get to decide, and then we can get some more engagement that way, by working with them directly and letting them be an active participant in the activities that they're going to be doing, but in such a way that we kind of set the stage for what is appropriate at that time. Similarly, I also, when it comes to boundaries, not only with like making decisions, but I'd like to set boundaries with the children on where we're going to be and what it is we're going to be doing and how far I feel it's comfortable for us to roam. Is it something where we need to make sure that we can always be within eyesight of each other and should always be able to see each other? As children get older, then maybe it's within the sound of one's voice, so that if we're walking around, as long as we can hear each other or call to each other. And of course, providing more flexibility and range as children get older. With this, I also, when we're developing what we want to do with children, if we have garden space or a yard, I like to create a place of their own for children. Whether this is a garden that we can work with them to help them tend, or an outdoor room that we might create with some plants, or define in some way with a bench or a chair or some way to delineate kind of a secret garden that is particularly that child's place, so that they have somewhere to go to when they're outside that is theirs to have a sense of ownership with, as well as to develop a sense of safety and security when they're outside. Um, I know for me, it was really the garden when I was really young was one of my favorite places. When I got older, there was a section of the backyard near a fence at a farmer's field that's kind of the place that I was always going to poke around at. And though, those spaces changed over time, I was thankful to have kind of these areas that were my own. And I feel that, to dive into my parenting perspective, I tend to be a permissive parent. And that was the way that I was raised. That's the way that I'm comfortable. So I personally give my children a lot of space and a lot of room, and I try to treat them with respect and in their ability to make decisions. And that providing space is one of those places where I feel that is really important. Um, as I mentioned a little bit ago, this is also at this young immersion stage is where I would begin to teach foraging. With my children, it was violets. We also were picking raspberries and other berries from the brambles in the yard. And in addition to kind of those wild foods that we might find, I also like the idea of foraging from a garden. So that if we have a garden, rather than, harvesting everything and taking it inside and washing it, that we can sit at the garden's edge and pick a ripe tomato and eat it right there in the garden as we're harvesting strawberries. Maybe not all of them make it inside with us, but rather we're there eating those strawberries fresh from the garden. And, if we feel comfortable with it because we know what's in our soil and what's available for our plants, I like to, not necessarily brush all the dirt off. Maybe what we're eating isn't, as clean as we might have for our kitchen table, but to provide that opportunity to show the ways in which we might encounter food that isn't anonymous, as would be the case in, our grocery store or a farmer's market, to see see that food come directly off the plant or out of the soil and into our mouths. If you are interested in foraging with children, Wildman Steve Brill, who I interviewed a number of years ago, has a book, Foraging with Kids, which is one that I would recommend. When he was on the show, it was he and his daughter Violet, and my understanding is that book was written with her in mind as well as other children. And it was I reviewed it a long time ago. I probably should have before tonight pulled it back up again, but it was just a book that I really enjoyed, and it's one that if you're interested in working more with children to add to your collection, yeah, Wildman Steve Brill, Foraging with Kids. Um, and because I live in an urban environment right now, I don't have access to as much land as I might have before. And so many of these activities for me are going to take place in local parks, which is something where I feel fortunate. Where I am here in Northern Virginia, we have something like 11 or 14 green spaces just within the municipality where I live, which is only about 2.5 square miles. And so, those are the places where I'll be taking my kids throughout the year. Even though they're a little bit older now, they're in that exploration and reflection period. But I think that any park with green space, even if it is kind of manicured and designed, is still an interesting place to go with kids to look at what we can find. What else is in that lawn beyond just grass? What kind of insects and bugs will we find crawling around there? Right now we have the cicadas that are out. So walking around and seeing the cicadas and where they happen to be. And then, also with our parks, looking for, if you have in your area, nature centers. I like nature centers for immersion because very often they have environmental educators or programs that were designed by environmental educators to present to children and families and are an easy way to engage. It's kind of fun, I think, in some ways, when you go to a nature center or a park environment that is staffed regularly over time, and they kind of get to watch your family grow up. And again, that reinforces that idea of repeated experiences throughout the year and year to year. And so, if your nature center has a particular festival that is held regularly, to go to that every year. One of my favorites was the Wetlands Festival held at a local nature center. And so, we got to see some of the folks who were there. And there are some specialty educators who would come. There was a fellow who had all kinds of bugs. Some of them were preserved and in cases, others were, available for you to handle, which was always kind of neat. I am not someone who always deals well with insects, but getting to see my daughter hold I think it was a rosé tarantula or a rose tarantula, had kind of a pink cast to it. That was kind of fun to experience. And even though, we want to be active participants in the lives of the children who are around us and bring these ideas into their lives, that it can be helpful to rely on other educators as well and their expertise because of what they have been working on. The bug guy. There's another fellow who would come to the Wetlands Festival who was part of a water conservation organization, and that fellow was a retired biologist. So he would go and get a couple of buckets of water from several of the different streams that were around us and bring them so that we could see what is available in the area. And then, my children and I would go to one of those streams because it was near where we lived and find a section of that stream bank and look for, tadpoles and minnows and all of the crawfish that were there, which, that kind of exposure to me is in this immersion stage is really, like, for me, one of the most important. By showing all of these examples, it gets kids more and more familiarized with what they can experience over time. And just as it's important to get to know certain things because as we know them, we can love them and care for them, I think that repeated exposure helps to reduce fears of many of these things. And though I mentioned in the last Children in Permaculture live stream about how, like, all of us are afraid of something. I'm not a big fan of snakes, but being able to have conversations about that and talk about that and have exposure to it helps reduce that. And again, creates more opportunities for care about what's around us and fall in love with it. Yeah. And with that, in addition to Steve Brill's book, another one that I would really recommend for anyone who's working with children, parents, or professionals, it's been around for a while, published originally in, I think it was 2005, is Richard Love's Last Child in the Woods. He talks about the idea of nature deficit disorder, and though that is not a clinical diagnosis by any means, it is a discussion about how, as our lives have changed and we've created a more technologically dependent and interconnected life, that children and adults are spending more time near the places where the electrical outlets are. And so, in addressing the fact that, this is what the current state of affairs are, he also provides a number of ways that we can help to repair that disconnection and reconnect with the world around us. And, as advocates for these kinds of things, in addition to promoting and supporting nature centers, the more that we use our parks, the more funding that will go towards them. And so if you're in an urban or suburban environment and I really, recommend getting out there. If there are festivals, being there so that you help to bolster those numbers. And just, signing guest books if there are any, checking in, if there are Facebook pages for any of the parks in your area, leaving comments, leaving comments on the website, contacting folks who are like the directors of parks and things like that. If you think of any improvements that could be made, the more that we as caretakers take care of those spaces, they're going to be available there for children in the future, so that we can continue from these young ages, not only immersing them in these spaces, but also helping to create additional opportunities for them to explore, and then when they're older, to reflect on what they've learned through these years of mentoring and tutelage that we've provided about the birds and the mammals and the insects and the flowers and the grasses and all the other green plants that we find in an area. And like for me, that was the big thing that got me connected to so much of what matters to me now. And it was a conversation in graduate school. How did we come to fall in love with the natural world, and why did we decide to go on this path? And for me, it was because I had some good mentors when I was young. Not only from my father, who would take me, semi regularly to go camping. He had a strange schedule when I was growing up. He worked a lot of shift work as an engineer, and so he wasn't always around, but he took every opportunity he could to get me out. Whether we were fishing on the banks of the Potomac, going to state park and taking advantage of the camping that was there, and then hiking during the day. I was an active member of my Cub Scout troop and spent a couple years, I was going to say did some time with, but that sounds a little off. But I was also a Boy Scout for a couple of years. And those scouting experiences and my mentors then really helped to deepen this care that I personally developed over all these years. And it's, part of what brings me back to permaculture are these early transformative experiences and formative experiences as a child. And so that's where, this series on children in permaculture, as a parent, as an educator, the more that we kind of dig into some of this, the more that it's emerging on just the importance of it, especially as children get older and we talk more about the tragedies and the problems, and we discuss climate change as kids get older. Giving them this love of earth, immersing them in permaculture, starting with those ethics, and asking, how does what we're doing care for earth? How is what we're doing care for people? How is what we're doing creating a surplus that we can give back to other people and the other than human? All of those pieces together build the knowledge that creates children who will care in the future, as well as helping to provide them with a worldview and a mindset that is resilient. Having a place of their own and knowing that nature is a place that they can go to and spend time to create a sense of well-being and to be able to express what they care about and where they want to be and what makes them feel good. I think all of that matters very deeply as we go through these very transitional times, and try to prepare future generations for what the world will look like. But yeah, so just to recap, as educators at this early stage for young children, toddler through about the third grade, so 7, 8 years old, let's focus on developing a love for where we are. Let's have easy, repeatable experiences, something we can do once a week, several times a month, year after year. When we are deciding what we're going to do, as parents, offer several choices so that children can be involved in choosing the activity that you're going to engage in. When you're out, set boundaries on how far you're going to roam from each other so that you can all have space to enjoy the activity that you're engaged in. And also provide a place for children in the environment that you have available to you that they might be able to call their own. Um, you know, much of my thought on that has kind of revolved around the idea of a back door or of a backyard or something like that. But for those of us who are city dwellers, sometime I'll have to take you all on a tour of where I live to give you an idea of the spaces that I am referring to. But, that space may just be a couple of pots where children are growing some plants of their own. If you're in an apartment and you're using a balcony, or maybe it's some window boxes, or a succulent of their own that they keep on a bookshelf in their room. But to create some kind of connection with nature where they are that is wholly their own. And then, yes, the books that I recommend from this conversation are Foraging with Kids by Wildman Steve Brill, a New York naturalist, and then Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. Real quick, if anybody who's here on the stream has any questions before we draw this to a close, if you want to drop those into the chat, I'm going to take a drink here real quick, discuss what the next live stream is going to be here on the 13th, and then draw this to a close. All right, so from here on June 13th, Sunday, will be the next live stream. That's scheduled for 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific, 7 p.m. GMT. And that will be a discussion of permaculture design, building on the last permaculture design conversation that looked at base maps and the zone model within permaculture. This time we're going to expand on that and look at sectors and vectors, which are the influences that are coming into our site, as well as the negative influences or conditions that we may want to mitigate. Again, that'll be this Sunday, June 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern. So everybody who was here with me this evening, as you came in and came out, thank you all for joining me here. It's kind of late for me, but I'm glad that we were able to join each other and have this presentation on continuing to immerse young children in the natural world and permaculture. Thank you all, and I'll see you again soon.